Each year, the graduating class elects a member of the faculty to speak at commencement. And the graduates this year have chosen exceptionally well. They have selected Stephen Wright. Steve has, for many years, led the Southern Center for Human Rights, an organization he founded that provides legal representation to those who are incarcerated and to those who face the sentence of death. Since 1993, Steve has also been a member of our faculty, teaching about capital punishment and supervising individual students in the representation of condemned prisoners. The large numbers of students who take Steve's course each year can attest to his remarkable skills as a teacher. With clarity and rigor, Steve guides his students through the tangled thicket of laws that surround the administration of death in our country's prisons. He provides them with intellectual and doctrinal guidance they need to operate in this complex field. But the students who take Steve's courses will tell you that he gives them much, much more. He gives them the unpretentious example of his own heroic commitment to the abolition of capital punishment. He shows them that the great dreams of reform that so many students bring with them when they come to Yale Law School are still, in fact, living options. He demonstrates that one can live a life of moral courage in the law, and that the law can be an instrument of improvement in the world. I was talking to one of Steve's students yesterday, and he said, listening to him talk is like listening to justice. And most astonishingly, I think, is that every day that Steve is here, he makes it plain that one can live a life of unrelenting moral courage and yet maintain pleasure in one's work and even a sense of humor about life. Many of us would have thought that a person as decent as Steve Wright, working in precincts as morally and as emotionally exhausting as those he has chosen for his life's work, would long ago have worn out and grown bitter with the world. But miraculously, Steve Wright has not, and Yale Law School has been unbelievably lucky to have had for so many years the radiant example of his humane courage and his remarkable spirit. So please join me in welcoming our 2012 commencement speaker, Stephen Wright.
Thank you. Please, don't stop. To all of you who are gathered here today, in particular the class of 2012 and any people who just wandered in for a pickup basketball game and wonder what's going on, I want to start out by saying yesterday I was at a college graduation, and at the start of the graduation, the president of the college got up and he said, now I don't want anybody to clap when anybody walks off this stage. I don't want any hooping and hollering. I don't want, and all this. And I thought, it's going to be so great to be at Yale tomorrow, where we have a raucous graduation and everybody where people have children and baseball caps and all these things. It's wonderful. It's wonderful. First of all, I want to thank the class of 2012 for asking me. It's a great honor for me to say, to put it mildly. Those of you who have taken my class, you knew it wasn't going to be too upbeat. So I really appreciate it. Up here? Oops, sorry, getting a little technical advice here. It's been a real honor for me to teach here for these years. It's sort of an honor and a challenge to teach people who are so much smarter than I am. But I found that with your help, we've sort of worked it out where we muddle through each semester. And it's been, when Dean Post talked about not being bitter, not being having a sense of humor, so much of that comes from the association I've had with this law school for the last 18 years. Secondly, I want to congratulate you and your family and your friends and everyone who have supported you throughout your lives and who made it possible for you to be here today, as Dean Post talked about earlier. I hope you have a wonderful celebratory day and that it is joyful in all regards, except for maybe the next few minutes. I do think, in light of the law review, we should commend Dean Post and give him an H in meteorology, because we wouldn't want to be in the courtyard today, would we? I don't think so. That's what's vision. That's visionary. Up until now, your life has been largely about yourself. It's a natural tendency to be self-centered as you grow up, and there's nothing wrong with that. Up until now, I think the right questions to ask are, what will I benefit from? What experiences, what courses, what internships, what places that I work, and what will I gain from those? But now it's time to pivot and ask a different question, which is, where are your extraordinary gifts needed? How do you make this legal world that you're coming into a better world? One where no one is shut out, one where the weak and vulnerable are not exploited, one that produces fair results based on the merits of the issues before it. And remember, you are in control of your lives. There may be a temptation, maybe not, but there may be a temptation upon graduating from this law school to pursue power and prestige for its own sake and worry later about whether that's really what you wanted to do or not. But I encourage you to make sure you go where you want to go, not where you're expected to go, not where somebody's telling you to go. You want good advice, I'm not denying that, but not necessarily where the greatest competition is, where you find your life in the law. I want to spend a few minutes just talking to you about something that I think is important to every one of you and every person who lives in this country, and that's our failure to make good on what is supposed to be the defining principle of our country, which is equal justice under law. Equal justice is in the Declaration of Independence. President Lincoln talked about it at Gettysburg. It's in the 14th Amendment. It's above the structure or above the entrance of the Supreme Court building, but it is not a reality in our courts. It has never been a reality, and it certainly is not a reality for racial minorities and the poor. I'm going to tell you one or two sad stories on this happy day, but I hope that they will serve a purpose and that you will take them to heart. And that you, no matter what you do in your legal careers, will take an interest in the plight of those who often speak in voices too faint to be heard, and that you will make a contribution to bringing us closer to the promise, and not a promise, it's a constitutional guarantee of equal justice under law. I received a letter just 2 weeks ago. I received a lot of letters like this, but this happens to be the most recent one, from a woman named Shanna Shackelford. She's an African-American woman, and for the last 3 years, she's had arson charges pending against her. The place she was rented was destroyed by fire. She lost everything that she had. She was homeless for some time, but she got 2 jobs, one at Walmart and one as a nurse's aide. Doesn't pay hardly anything, but she was able to get a new place to live. And she continued her studies at a community college. After she was charged, she asked for a public defender. Here's her description from what she wrote me of what happened next. The lawyer I got is an addict, and anyone who sees him can tell that at first glance. He's incompetent, and I did most of the investigation myself. I complained, and 3 months later, another lawyer was added to my case. She constantly encouraged me, a person who has never been charged with any crime of any sort in my life, to take 15 years in prison, offered by the prosecution. I declined. A friend provided $3,500 of a $5,000 fee, and so I got my own attorney. This attorney misses court dates for weeks at a time. He's been fined by the court for not appearing. I've been to court so many times and been told to come back the next day, and then the next day, and then the next day, because my lawyer's not there, that I lost both my jobs. I've asked over and over to proceed with trial, but when the trial date comes up, my lawyer doesn't even show up. I have no money to pay this man and no way to hire a new lawyer. I have no place to go. I am a certified nurse's aide, but I cannot find employment because this arson charge is hanging over me. I don't know how to fix this, and I have asked to be placed in jail until this is over. I ask this not to sound ungrateful for being out on bond, but because I fear I may take my own life or die from the conditions of being homeless. That request was denied as well. The last offer was 10 years on probation and restitution of $500,000. I told my attorney absolutely not, and he said, if you don't take this one, there may not be another one. I told him, I don't care if I sit in prison for 20 years, I will never, all caps, accept blame for something I didn't do. A guilty plea, even with no jail time, will ruin my life more than this case has already. It means I could never use my degree effectively or be taken seriously. I've had over 20 continuances. I've lost my jobs, I've lost my home, I've lost my dogs. I now sleep in my car. I'm going to lose my car because I can't repay the loan I took out to pay some expenses for the lawyer. I'm tired and I'm beaten and I don't understand how to fight this. My only question is, what do I do now that I have no way to care for myself, no place to go, and an uninterested attorney? It's been days now since I've eaten, and I'm constantly feel myself getting sick. I don't want to die without someone knowing what these people are doing to me, and now I have cried and pleaded and begged for help in the last 3 years. I'm only 23, Mr. Wright, and I have fought to stay afloat for the last 3 years. I just want to know what there is left for me to do while I'm still here. I want you to know that there are thousands of people like Shanna Shackelford who are crying and pleading and begging for help, and almost all of those cries go unanswered. 50 years ago, the Supreme Court said people were entitled to a lawyer, that they were necessities in our legal system. The court also said that there can be no equal justice when the kind of justice a person gets depends upon the amount of money he or she has. And yet we all know that the kind of justice a person like Ms. Shackelford receives depends completely upon the amount of money she has, or the lack of money. In the state courts, where the overwhelming majority of criminal cases are processed, all but a few cannot afford a lawyer. Many will receive no representation or only token representation. Some will be fortunate enough to get high-quality representation because over the years, a number of people from this law school and others have gone out to try to make the promise of the right to counsel and equal justice a reality, at least for the people they represent. I was out in San Diego recently, and somebody who was in my very first class in 1993, 18 years later, still there as a public defender. But a person who is arrested and tried and who can afford a lawyer, of course, will get a lawyer right then. If you've been in the drunk tank, you know how bad you want to get out. I won't ask for a show of hands, but if you've ever been there, you want out, and you want a lawyer to get you out. And if you're a person of means, or if you have parents who can afford a lawyer, you'll be out within a day because you'll retain a lawyer and get out. But the poor people may not see lawyers for weeks or months. Many will lose their jobs, their homes, their cars, their ability to pay their child support payments, even though the charges may be dismissed ultimately against them. One woman arrested near Syracuse, New York, was not able to take care of her husband who was on dialysis, and as a result of not being able to get out because she didn't have a lawyer, her husband died. Later, the charges were dismissed, but she was punished rather severely. Most of those accused of minor charges will have a chance at some point to get out of jail by pleading guilty and being sentenced to time served. Those who maintain their innocence must stay in jail even longer. Some lawyers appointed to represent the poor are so incompetent they can't even file their papers on time. We've had people now in Florida, Alabama, and Texas who've been executed with no federal review of their cases, no federal review whatsoever, because their lawyers missed the statute of limitations for filing. That's about as basic as it gets, the statute of limitations. And in Texas, one lawyer has missed in 3 different cases for 3 different clients the statute of limitation, meaning there's absolutely no federal review, which is the only review that amounts to anything in Texas because the judges are elected. And the only real review you get, if you get any at all, is going to be in the federal courts. It didn't bother the Texas judiciary, the Texas bar, the lawyers still handling cases. I get several letters and call like Ms. Shackelford's every week, and our office receives many, many more. Most are urgent, someone calling on behalf of a person who doesn't have a lawyer and needs one for some desperate reason, someone facing sometimes a child, deportation without a lawyer, a mother calling about her child being raped in prison. We get a lot of those calls. People being evicted from their homes, veterans back from Iraq and Afghanistan with all sorts of problems, such as losing their jobs and then being thrown in jail because they can't pay their child support. Children being thrown out of school for all sorts of trivial reasons. Children and adults being placed in solitary confinement for long periods of time, which destroys their mental health. And people going to debtors' prisons in clear violation of the law because they lost their jobs and they can't pay fees or child support. And usually there's nothing we can do. The volume is too great, our workload is too great to begin with, and many of these calls come from all over the country and many in areas of the law we don't even practice. But we do listen, and we answer questions, and we try to help people in whatever way we can besides those that we help directly. But it reminds us every day of how many people are in desperate need of legal representation. With regard to Ms. Shackelford, I knew that several people in this graduating class would be texting me right now saying that they would work on the case if only I would take it. In fact, Shanna, our Lyman fellow here, is all ready to volunteer to work on the case, so last Friday we undertook her representation. But that's a rare exception. We're also reminded every day that the legal system is the part of our society that's been least affected by the civil rights movement. Even after the Equal Protection Clause was adopted after the Civil War, it was followed by not equal protection, but racial segregation, Jim Crow justice, lynchings, convict leasing. Alabama managed to perpetuate slavery all the way until World War II with convict leasing. Now we have mass incarceration, 2.3 million men, women, and children in prisons and jails, the highest incarceration rate of any country in the world. At a cost of $70 billion a year, we've let the schools go to hell in a handbasket while we've paid for these prisons. We know that people of color are more likely than white people to be stopped by the police, to be mistreated during the stop, to be arrested at the end of it, to face more serious charges, to be denied bail, and to get harsher sentences. We also know that people of color are less likely to be seated on juries because peremptory strikes continue to be used, as they always have, against racial minorities. I go to courthouses on the day of arraignment in many places, and it looks like a slave ship is docked outside the courthouse. All these black men in orange jumpsuits, handcuffed together, brought in, put in the jury box or in the first few rows, and some lawyer comes along and goes down, spends about 5 to 15 minutes with each one. And then the judge takes the bench, and virtually everyone pleads guilty. It's called meet 'em and plead 'em. It's a fairly common practice from Georgia to California. Several constitutional violations there, not only equal justice, but right to counsel, due process. In fact, it's a complete mockery of justice. There's no justice at all. There's no judging going on. There's no lawyering going on. It's like a fast food restaurant. In fact, in Michigan, they call these days when they take these pleas, McJustice days. And the result is that more than 60% of the people in prison are racial and ethnic minorities. 1 of 3 African-American men between 8 and 30, as you may know, are in prison, jail, probation, or parole. There are more African-Americans under correctional control today than there were in slavery in 1850. Chief Justice Stevens reminded us just a few weeks ago that the Chief Justice of the United States has said the way to stop discrimination on the basis of race is to stop discriminating on the basis of race. He needs to take that message to every prosecutor, to every judge, to every clerk, every jailer, every justice of the peace, and every law enforcement person in this country. He needs to say, stop charging on the basis of race. Stop striking jurors on the basis of race. Stop stopping people on the streets on the basis of race. But of course, we don't really take his statement at face value because it was in the context of the court's retrenchment from Brown versus Board of Education that started in the 1970s. The court won't deal with race, but we have to be persistent in raising race until it can't be denied anymore. I want to talk about one other thing. People accused of crimes, of course, get lawyers. They're entitled to them, whether they get them or not, or whether they get them from only a short time, or whether they're very incompetent. But people with compelling needs in civil cases have no access to a lawyer at all. I had a mother call me in February, and she told me that she had been divorced in 2005 in Georgia, moved to Florida, and had custody of the one child of that marriage, 15 years old, well-adjusted in his school and community, many friends, active in sports, and in the Junior Honorary Society. She told me a harrowing tale about what happened in a courtroom in Georgia, where she was asked to come for what was supposed to be a routine status hearing, but instead, she got some home cooking. The judge took the child away from her and awarded custody to the father. She had no notice that custody would be an issue. No guardian was appointed to look out for the interests of the child, who desperately wanted to stay with his mother. The father, of course, had a lawyer, a local lawyer there. It's doubtful that the Georgia court even had jurisdiction over her and the child, but she was absolutely helpless because she didn't have a lawyer. She didn't know what to do. Whatever protection the law provided to her and that child were out of reach because she had no lawyer. And all the law that you've learned here in the last 3 years means absolutely nothing to a person who's unable to afford a lawyer. A parent's loss of a child and a child's loss of the life he was living, significant deprivations. But she is one of thousands of people who have all sorts of issues like this and who have no way to get into court. The Federal Legal Services Corporation has offices throughout the country, but its funding is so meager that it can only provide representation to about 20% of the people eligible for its services. When I called Georgia Legal Services on behalf of this mother who had called me, they said, we don't take any family cases unless there's violence involved because we just have so many cases and we have to draw the line somewhere. And so if somebody's threatened with violence, we can't help this lady. Neither could any law firm. Last November, the Congress slashed funding for legal services by $56 million, 15% cut, continuing a steady decline in the funding for civil legal services. The corporation's budget for 2012 is $348 million, less than half of what it was at the end of the Carter administration, $770 million. So as the number of poor people has increased and their situations have become even more desperate in the recession, they've had less access to the courts. And it speaks volumes about our society with its enormous wealth that it is cutting access to the courts for the poor and other programs for the poor in order to avoiding adding a penny of taxation to the wealthiest people in the society, making millions of dollars. And some are proposing, even more cuts to education, to food stamps, to job training programs, and other programs for the poor, and undoubtedly legal services will be among them, in order to give even more tax cuts to the wealthy. I find this deeply troubling, and I hope you do too. People in the highest income bracket were taxed at 90% in the 1950s, 70% from 1965 to 1981, and 50% from 1982 to 1986. Today, some say they shouldn't even be taxed at 35%. And of course, Warren Buffett tells us that very often they pay something like 15%. Justice Brandeis warned, we may have democracy or we may have wealth concentrated in the hands of the few, but we cannot have both. We're going to find out, or we are finding out, whether he was right about that or not. Part of the effort to cut programs for the poor and to cut taxes for the rich is including demonizing poor people, suggesting they're not really poor, or blaming them for their poverty as if they caused the recession, as if they're responsible for Apple and all these other companies moving jobs to China and Mexico and other places, as if they caused the injuries suffered in Iraq and Afghanistan that make people unable to do work today, as if some people chose to suffer from mental illness or intellectual disabilities. Have we lost our moral bearings? Have we abandoned principles like the strong protect the weak for the benefit of all? And the duty of privilege is absolute integrity. The poor are not a faceless mask. Every person is an individual. Over 20% of our children, and our children are all our children, are living in poverty. For some parents and children, days are spent going through garbage cans and dumpsters to try to find food to eat and cans and bottles to sell. I've worked with and for the poor for my whole life in the law, 37 years. But my clients and their families and others I have served have enriched my life, my work, my writing, my advocacy, my teaching. I've been awed by the magnitude of their struggles, dismayed by the limits on their opportunities, such as the denial of a decent education, which then denies opportunity and denies hope. And I'm inspired by their incredible resilience with so many things up against them. I came into this work because I had the great privilege to grow up during the Martin Luther King era, the time between the Montgomery bus boycott, led by Rosa Parks, and Dr. King's assassination in 1968. It was a time of turbulence and tragedy. It involved a life and death struggle just simply to end racial segregation and to get black children a decent education and to let black people vote. And the struggle over that was remarkable, and it's still going on today. All the places I go, there's still the all-white segregation academy because so many people don't want their children to go to school with black children. In just 39 years with us, Dr. King inspired us with his courage, he motivated us with his eloquence, and he taught us with his words and his deeds. I took away two essential lessons from Dr. King: that nothing is more important than ending poverty, racism, materialism, and militarism. And nothing is less important than how much we make doing it. Obviously, the vast majority of people have not followed that suggestion, but a few have followed the teachings of Dr. King, and many of them have lived rich and fulfilling lives. I ask you not to forget the poor, both those caught up in the legal system and those who cannot get into the legal system, and to help them in some way during your career in the law. You will not learn the reality of their plight by reading an article, a book, a study, or a Supreme Court opinion. You need to go to the criminal courts and watch what's happening and be as horrified as my students are when they go for the first time. You need to represent some of the people I've described. You need to visit the soup kitchens and get to know people that are eating there and listen to their stories. As Dietrich Bonhoeffer observed, there is an experience of incomparable value to see things from below, from the perspective of the outcast, the suspects, the maltreated, the powerless, the oppressed, and the reviled. In short, from the perspective of those who suffer, and to look with new eyes on matters large and small. A number of you, I know, will represent people who desperately need a competent lawyer, and you will make a difference, Catherine and others, case by case. And if for some reason others of you cannot because you work for the government or whatever, I would suggest that you be a big brother or a big sister to some child, not somebody from the suburbs, from a child who's destitute, a child whose family is destitute, that struggles to put food on the table and to keep shelter over its head, that lives in the car sometimes because there's nowhere else to live. And as you get to know that child and her family and you see the disadvantages visited upon her and the opportunities denied her, you will look with new eyes on matters great and small. The injustices that continue to pile up require that we make good on this promise of equal justice. Courts have no credibility, no legitimacy when they tolerate perfunctory representation or no representation and racial discrimination. It's a huge undertaking. It's the continuation of a struggle that's gone on throughout our history, from the Declaration of Independence, which was signed by slaveholders, up until where we are today. And at the moment, it looks like a losing battle, but it's only a moment, and it's your moment. Dr. King said, we stand on the shoulders of others so that people can stand on our shoulders. And now, it's your turn. It's something much bigger than any of us, than all of us, but we have the ability to help one person at a time. We have the ability in a variety of ways to bring us closer to being the kind of country we proclaim to be, but fall so short of being. The Challenger sums up, Dr. Dean Post quoted Langston Hughes, and I'll end with Langston Hughes. Summarize this pretty well. There's a dream in the land with its back against the wall. There are those who claim this dream for theirs alone, a sin for which we know they surely must atone. Because unless shared in common, like the sunlight and the air, this dream will die for lack of substance anywhere. This dream knows no frontier tongue, this dream, no class or race. This dream cannot be kept secure in any one locked place. This dream today embattled with its back against the wall. To save the dream for one, it must be saved for all. Thank you again. Good luck and Godspeed.